Hello friends, it is indeed my pleasure to welcome all of you to our discussion today on the topic of constitutional history of Russia as part of the topic 3 of paper 4, that is comparative government and politics. Now, at the very outset, it needs to be mentioned that the constitutional history of Russia, which was previously Soviet Union, has been divided into 3 parts. And for a systematic discussion, the thrust of my paper is that I have subdivided my paper into 3 parts relating to each of the periods to make a systematic discussion of the discourse on the constitutional history and political traditions of Russia. The first period on which I have touched upon is the period between 1800 to 1917, and here what I have tried to focus upon is the fact that the Russian Federation, located in Central Asia, is a densely populated area with great ethnic diversity. The composition of the population is a mixed one, and we find that while 81.5% are Russians, 3.8% are Tatars, 3% Ukrainians, 0.9% Bashirs, Belarusians 0.8% and 0.7% Moldavians, which show many ethnic groups and a lot of diversity in the population of Russia. The Constitution of Russian Federation came into force on December 12, 1993, after winning independence from Soviet Union on 24th August 1991. In this context, an analysis on the constitutional history of Russia reveals that it has its origins in the 19th century. The idea of reforming Russia's political system by creating a constitution that would ensure citizens their personal freedoms became popular under the Tsar Alexander I when he occupied the throne of Russia. In fact, Poland was also granted a constitution by Tsar Alexander I. At the time, work continued at the same time for drawing a constitution of Russia itself, which culminated in the 1820 founding state document of the Russian Empire. However, the adoption of this document and also that of Poland got postponed primarily due to lack of consensus and agreement. Russia came close to adopting a constitution during the reign of the reformist Tsar Alexander II. This was primarily possible due to the abolition of serfdom in 1861 and steps to establish a local government system in the towns and countryside, which gave hopes to the fact that the country would get a constitution. However, the death of Alexander II interrupted the constitutional process in Russia. Constitutional reforms in Russia began in earnest with the manifestos issued by the state order in 1905, which proclaimed the necessity of civil liberties for the people based on genuine personal freedoms. The manifesto declared that no law could be put into effect without the approval of the State Duma. The Tsar, it however needs to be mentioned, kept a firm control on the constitutional process of the state. The Fundamental State Law of April 23, 1906 developed the provisions of the manifesto. The fundamental laws establish a 2-chambered parliament, the State Duma and the State Council. The Council of Ministers were transformed into a permanent body appointed by the Tsar, but who were accountable to the Tsar for all their actions. In this context, it needs to be mentioned that despite such endeavors and such steps being taken, the Tsar retained complete control on the work of the government and regarding settling government policy, particularly in the areas of issues dealing with foreign policy of Russia. With the introduction of voting rights, however, large sections of people got the right to participate in the elections. Although the reformist plans that arose in Tsarist Russia paved the way for considerable transformation, their implementation, however, was postponed primarily due to the various internal and external circumstances, among which lack of consensus in society was a very, very vital factor, and it was a great necessity for any kind of policy implementation. Now we cover and look upon the second period, that is the period between 1917 to 1993. At the very outset, it needs to be mentioned that the constitution of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic of 1918, unfortunately, was very class-based in character. It was adopted on 10 July 1918. It reflected the slogans proclaimed by the Bolsheviks as they prepared the coup for 1917. All power was given to the Soviets, private land ownership was absolutely abolished, and rights of social groups were restricted to a very, very large extent. A very unfortunate issue regarding this constitution was that it was undemocratic in nature. It did not have a representative character based on democratic principles of governance. There were no parliamentary institutions too, and the issue of overstepping or abusing authority had been not raised, and the principle of division of powers under such circumstances was absolutely meaningless. In 1925, the Soviet Constitution was adopted following the formation of Soviet Union in 1924. This constitution reproduced in large part the provisions of the 1918 Constitution. In accordance with the provisions of the 1924 Constitution, a new draft of the Constitution was adopted in 1925. This new Constitution, unlike the previous version, no longer contained provisions about crushing the exploiter class or pursuing world revolution. A new constitution was later adopted on 5th December 1936 with the objective of pursuing socialism and strengthening the foundations of socialism and the principles of communism. It set out the economic principles of socialism and abolished private property and emphasized the need of state economic planning for regulating the economic activities of the state. The emergence of the communist China in 1949, in fact, gave a great boost to the socialist movement of the world at this time, and it needs to be mentioned that a significant development was the outbreak of Cold War, which played a vital role in regarding to the political developments in Soviet Union at that time and other parts of the world, and making Soviet Union emerge as a superpower of the world. The conflict continued unabated between USSR and USA on the other, which formed the two blocs, and despite every possible kind of attempt to reduce the tension between 1970 to 1980, it continued with the breakup and disintegration of Soviet Union in 1991. The construction of a new communist society did not proceed rapidly as had been hoped by the previous constitutions, and these delays were primarily reflected in the adoption of another Soviet constitution for the proclaiming the construction of developed socialist society. The Supreme Soviet of Russia adopted a constitution in 1977 which extended rights to the Soviet citizens too. However, the main goal of the Soviet constitution remained the building of communism under the control of a totalitarian state headed by the Soviet Communist Party, which could be the guiding force and the principal component of the Soviet political system and the state and the public organizations. The purpose of the Communist Party was that it was to exist for the people and was to serve the people as a whole. Over the many years of existence, the Constitution underwent radical change and transformation, not just on individual provisions of the Constitution, but also related to the essence of the document too. Beginning in the second half of the 1980s, the Constitution reflected a gradual renunciation of building communism, the leading role of the Communist Party, and the Soviet. At the same time, it began to accord greater right to issues like human rights, private property, and the principle of division of powers. The policy of liberalization of Soviet society and political system and the restructuring of Soviet economy, which was introduced by Gorbachev around 1985, had a great impact on the political developments and traditions of Soviet Union at that time. His concepts of glasnost and perestroika began guiding the socialist principles to a great extent and played a vital role in restructuring the economic pattern and way of functioning. He came forward with the desire to usher in the process of globalization by opening up the economy in international market, and he welcomed opening out in international relations through a rejection of Cold War and lent support to the policies of peaceful coexistence, disarmament, and also ensure mutual cooperation among the big powers of the world for mutual benefit and mutual exchange. He introduced liberalization, democratization in public decision making. He in fact adopted the policy of liberalization towards the West, and his policies of glasnost and perestroika, which had become very popular at that time, were instrumental in the liberalization of Eastern Europe too during 1988 to 1990. In USSR too, the new restructuring and liberalization got transformed into a movement for democratization and for providing rights and freedoms to the people. An unfortunate event, however, which took place was the outburst of ethnic strifes, and one of the examples of such an ethnic strife was the outbreak of an unsuccessful ethnic strife sometime in 1991, but which clearly displayed and showed the weakness of the central government to manage the ethnic conflicts in a predominant way. The power struggle between Gorbachev on the one hand and an emerging leader, Boris Yeltsin, on the other, came to the forefront during this period, and by November 1991, 9 of the republics of USSR declared themselves sovereign independent states and chose to form a loose confederation of independent states. The post of the president was introduced, and the Declaration of Human Rights and civil rights in the Russian Federation was adopted on November 22nd, 1991. The declaration introduced new opportunities to create political parties with a significant impact on the political life of the nation, and it was believed that these political parties, with the spirit of democratization and liberalization that had been introduced in Russia at that time, would definitely play a vital role. Finally, due to such separatist tendencies and due to such plural forces playing a vital role, finally on 31st December 1991, unfortunately, the USSR was replaced by Russia, and with the rise of Russia, a superpower, that is USSR, got confined to the pages of history. Now, we now turn to the section C, where we shall focus upon the newly constituted constitution, that is the Constitution of Russia of 1993. Now, collapse of USSR can be legitimately described as one of the most astounding as well as unfortunate events in the latter decade of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century internationally. The collapse had a deep impact on the nature and course of world politics, and the entire international environment seemed to change by the last decade of the 20th century, and the 21st century opened by being characterized by big ideological and strategic challenges, struggling to adjust with the new realities of the post-USSR world. The new constitution came into force on December 25th, 1993. The constitution tried to improve the country's federal structure. The constitution represents the highest law in the country, and along with the constitution, the president was made also the highest authority. The duty of the president was to protect the rights of the people, ensure general welfare of the people, and also safeguard the sovereignty of Russia. With this, we generally come to a conclusion regarding the discussion, a brief discussion of the constitutional history and political traditions of the Russian development of Russian constitution. Now, in conclusion, one can say that an analysis of the Russian constitution and an analysis of the political traditions of Russia show that it has been influenced deeply by the orthodox principles of Marxism, Leninism, with suitable modifications from time to time. Russia has faced conflicting realities and situations and has a historical legacy which has been characterized by a shift from orthodox communist order to a system of governance characterized by democratization and liberalization to a large extent. Both the countries, but that is Russia and China, the greatest socialist states in the world, have reflected a socialist tradition, but a wind of change has blown, and the current has blown in the political, social, economic life of both these states, and particularly in Soviet Union, which led to the disintegration and breakup of Soviet Union, led to the creation of Russia, and as a result there has been suitable modification, change and reform of the socialist political tradition that existed in Russia since a long time. A wind of change has blown in most socialist states of the world, and Russia is not an exception like China. Thus, the socialist political tradition that has been held by Russia has come to an end or has declined after the disintegration of Soviet Union that has occurred from time to time from 31st December 1991 when USSR was replaced by Russia. With the rise of Russia, although it is said that a superpower got confined to the pages of history and Cold War internationally came to an end and the world seems to have become unipolar with the decline of one superpower, the ultimate conclusion lies that Russia over the years might emerge again as one of the vital emerging powers of the world and particularly not only a regional but an international power all over the world in international relations. In this context, one needs to definitely mention that along with China, Russia too shows a kind of pragmatism and farsight in the transformation and the transition and the shift that has been brought about from orthodox ideas of Marxism and Leninism, which were applied to it to the greatest possible extent, to the shift to an era of democratization, liberalization by restructuring the economy and liberalizing the society and polity to a great extent. It was definitely a farsight on the part of Gorbachev during the 1980s to decide on opening up of the economy for the purpose of economic development and modernization, which has been realized also by China to a great extent. The shift of Russia from an era which was dominated by the orthodox principles of Marxism and Leninism to an era of liberalization and restructuring of the economy and rendering of individual rights and freedoms to the people has definitely been commendable and is worth appreciating. The declaration which was made in Russia in 22nd November 1991, which guaranteed new opportunities by promising to provide particular rights to the people and give an opportunity to political parties, definitely has a significant impact on the political life of the country. In this context, it needs to be mentioned also that it was primarily the pragmatism of the later leaders of both the countries that they realized the need to capture the international market, build up international relations and interstate relations which had not been realized by the founding fathers of these states to a great extent. One however, criticism and question and debate that comes up with the decline and disintegration of Soviet Union is that whether socialism has come to an end or Marxism, for that matter, has lost all kinds of relevance with the disintegration of this great superpower. The principle and the main ideology of Marxism can never die. But the way it was perhaps applied in Russia, our former Soviet Union, was at fault, and it was for this reason that it was difficult to sustain the basic principles of Marxism, original Marxism and Leninism, and it was for that reason that there was a lack on the part of the central coordinating authority to bring about total state planning and encourage democratic centralism, which was advocated by Lenin to a great extent. It was perhaps the lack on the part of the foresight of the leaders of Russia, for that matter, or power struggle and crisis in leadership, which led to the decline of and disintegration of Soviet Union, which led to a superpower being confined in the pages of history in the future. The emergence of the Russian Federation in 1993 after the disintegration of Soviet Union in December 1991, in fact, has made Russia play a very vital role in the present situation of international relations. A lot needs to be seen in future whether Russia will be able to continue with its position and establish itself as one of the formidable international players in the world. Undoubtedly, it plays a very vital role in international organizations like the United Nations and other regional organizations. However, it has successfully shown how successfully a socialist state can transform itself from an orthodox system of totalitarian control under the dictatorship of the working class to a liberalized and an open system by adjusting to the prevailing currents of international relations that are blowing in its countries. It has also demonstrated the fact that the economic development and the priority of all-round development is very important, along with ensuring the social welfare of the people, and most important is that the guarantee of fundamental rights and other human freedoms to individuals reflects the humanitarian outlook of the Russian government to a great extent, which has been highlighted by the 1993 constitution that has come up after Russia was formed in 1993. Last but not the least, it needs to be mentioned that both the socialist states which have emerged as important powers, that is China and Russia, are playing a very vital role in the international arena of trade as well as economic transactions. However, it needs to be also seen that whether it will be able to sustain and maintain its development in a sustainable way by giving priority to issues of development as well as also maintaining the welfare of the people in general. It is very important whether social priorities will find an important place in its agenda in the future. A crucial question that arises after the disintegration of the Soviet Union and rise of Russia is whether Marxism or socialism has lost its total relevance. As a principle, as an ideology, Marxism or socialism can never die. But perhaps because of certain internal and external conditions which were unique in Russia itself, there was a lapse in the way of application of the Marxian and the principles of Leninism, the way it was applied in Russia, which was the reason for its collapse and for its decline. So, in other words, I conclude by saying that although Russia has successfully now been transformed into a liberal democratic state from an orthodox socialist totalitarian state, whether it will be able to sustain its development in a balanced manner is something which we need to look into the future, and we have to be optimistic to let this new nation which was formed in 1993 to grow in an all-round manner and in the best possible extent, so that again we can be proud that there are many internationally strong actors in this world for protection of international peace and security.